Chapter 11 is focusing on the start of the Jeffersonian Republic, the transition from the Federalist Party over to the Democratic Republicans from 1800 to 1812. Now, to begin, we obviously know from the past chapter that the Federalists had made the terrible mistake of creating the Alien and Sedition Acts, which the people of America were starting to realize how terrible they actually were. So it really started to backfire on the Federalist Party because they were becoming much more unpopular due to these pieces of legislation. Also add to the fact that Alexander Hamilton, who was, an enemy to John Adams, was extremely angry that there was never a war with France. And so for this and some other reasons, we see a split within the Federalist Party between the Federalists led by Hamilton and the Federalists led by John Adams. So for this reason, John Adams, going into the election of 1800, is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because not only is he unpopular from the outside, but he is also unpopular within his party as well. Now, Thomas Jefferson, moving into this election, obviously is looking to become president of the United States, so he is, in a sense, campaigning for the presidency, even though it was ungentlemanly at the time to go out and campaign, so his people did, but mudslinging even back in 1800 as well. Jefferson's character was attacked. His affair with his slave, Sally Hemings, was published in the newspapers at the time, and also the fact that Thomas Jefferson was in favor of separation of church and state really started to scare the very religious people of America, many people thinking that he was actually an atheist. The reality was he was not an atheist, he was a deist, which we will talk about in chapters to come. So in the 1800 election, remember, this is still in a period of time where whoever wins the first place spot in the Electoral College becomes president, and the second place winner becomes vice president. This changes after the 12th Amendment, where people now run on a ticket. But until that time, the Democratic Republicans were looking to have Thomas Jefferson be the first place winner, aka the president, and Aaron Burr from New York to be the second place winner and therefore be his vice president. The problem with this strategy is that the electors in the Electoral College each get 2 votes, and so when it came time to cast their votes, they cast one for Thomas Jefferson and one for Aaron Burr. This resulted in a tie between Burr and Jefferson, and so according to the Constitution, the election was thrown to the House of Representatives, where each state got 1 vote to cast. Now, the problem with this is that the members of the House of Representatives are still Federalists who have just recently been voted out of office. This is what's known as a lame duck period. You have been voted out of office, but you still technically hold power until until the term for the next guys starts, which in this case was March of 1801. So for this long window of time between November of 1800 and March of 1801, the Federalists still technically controlled Congress. And these lame duck Federalists were looking for any way they could to hurt Thomas Jefferson. They're angry with him for essentially getting them voted out of office. So during this lame duck period of time, the representatives cast ballot after ballot after ballot, trying to hurt Thomas Jefferson and get Aaron Burr named as president, which obviously would be ridiculous. In the end, based on actually a deal that was struck between Hamilton and Jefferson, Hamilton got some of his Federalist buddies to stop casting their vote for Aaron Burr, and in the end, Thomas Jefferson was declared the winner in the election of 1800. Now, upon hearing the news that he had been elected president for the United States, Thomas Jefferson declared this to be a revolution of 1800 for a couple of reasons. Number one, he felt that this was a revolution because for the first time in history, we are seeing a peaceful transfer of power from one party to the next. This is revolutionary. This is not happening in any other part of the world. The Federalists aren't raising an army to contain their power like we see elsewhere in the world at this time. So this is awesome, according to Thomas Jefferson. Also, he felt it was a revolution because the Federalists had betrayed their ideals. They'd betrayed the ideals of republicanism. So Jefferson felt that it was his duty to bring back these republican ideals and to check the growing power of the federal government. Now, in Thomas Jefferson's inaugural address, he tried to allay the fears of the American people, saying that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. And what he basically meant by this was that regardless of whether we're Federalists or regardless of whether we're Republicans, we are all Americans to begin with. And he wasn't looking to completely change the government. He wasn't looking to completely redo everything that had already been done under the Federalist Party. He was looking for more mild reforms. So to start with, he granted many pardons for anyone that had been convicted of the Sedition Act. He returned the residency requirement from 14 years back to 5 years in order to be eligible to vote. He got rid of the excise tax more than anything because he felt it would put an undue hardship on farmers in the South and in the West. And if you remember anything about Thomas Jefferson, he loves farmers. And as far as his economic policies, his new Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, who was a Frenchman, wasn't looking to undo every single thing that Alexander Hamilton had done at the Treasury Department. Once again, only mild reforms, specifically looking to reduce the debt and to balance the budget. But other than that, many of Hamilton's policies were continued into the Jefferson term in office, proving to the American people that just because we have a change in party doesn't mean that everything else has to change. In comes the fight between the presidency and the judicial branch. Now, this is a great story in American history, the story of Marbury versus Madison, which is an extremely important court case for American history. Now, going back to that lame duck period of time when the Federalists still technically controlled both the White House and Congress as well, but were on their way out the door. In 1801, at the last minute, the Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, creating 16 new federal judgeships, all of whom had to be filled by the president. Now remember, all federal judges are appointed for life. So at the last minute, the American people have already spoken. They don't want the Federalists running the country anymore. They want the Democratic Republicans running the country. But at the last minute, nonetheless, the Federalists create all these new judges and start filling them with Federalist appointees. And remember, these are appointments for life. Here's the problem with these midnight judges, so to speak, because they were given their appointments literally at midnight. The problem is that the president signed their orders, but some of them were not delivered simply because there was not time to get all of these appointments hand-delivered to them. Now, the person in charge of hand-delivering these appointments was the Secretary of State under John Adams, whose name was John Marshall. So when Thomas Jefferson comes to the White House, he's so angry with the appointments of all these midnight judges that the couple of guys who were left behind or who got lost in the shuffle, he ordered his new Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver those appointments to those judges. One person in particular, William Marbury, who was supposed to be the Justice of the Peace for the District of Columbia, never received his appointment before. So he filed a lawsuit against James Madison to deliver his appointment so that he could be Justice of the Peace for D.C. Now, Thomas Jefferson is not having this. This is not going to happen no matter what. And so this court case, Marbury versus Madison, was taken to the Supreme Court. Now, here's why, and this is a random piece of information. William Marbury based his lawsuit on the Judiciary Act of 1789. One part of that saying that if you are going to sue a member of the federal government, the court of original jurisdiction is the Supreme Court. Well, now here is John Marshall. He had previously been Secretary of State, if you're following along, under John Adams. Now he himself is a midnight judge, and he's sitting as Chief Justice on the Supreme Court hearing this case. He's the reason why William Marbury did not receive his appointment in the beginning. But he also knows that even if he rules in favor of William Marbury, which obviously he wanted to do, a president had signed his order, yet he's not receiving it, Thomas Jefferson was refusing to grant this order. And basically, if he doesn't if he does agree with William Marbury, it's going to reduce the power of the Supreme Court simply because the president is going to ignore this order. But at the same time, if he does just what Thomas Jefferson wants him to do, he's basically going to become a lapdog for the president. So here's John Marshall stuck between a rock and a hard place. But what he does is create the power of judicial review. basically what he said to William Marbury: I'm sorry you cannot have your appointment as Justice of the Peace because you based your lawsuit on an unconstitutional part of the Judiciary Act of 1789. The Constitution says that only foreign diplomats can bring their court cases to the Supreme Court. So this court of original jurisdiction is not the Supreme Court. And so basically what he does is, while William Marbury, got, forgotten in the end, he creates the power of judicial review. And this is the important part. Judicial review gives the Supreme Court the power to be the one to decide whether laws are constitutional or not, finally clearing up this issue that has been circulating since the Constitution was written. Is it is it the Supreme Court or is it the states? Judicial review unequivocally says it's the Supreme Court. And the reason this stuck is because nobody challenged this decision. Thomas Jefferson was just excited for the fact that he didn't have to give William Marbury his appointment or ignore John Marshall. So because this precedent was set, all future Supreme Court decisions are going to be based on Marbury versus Madison. They have the power to determine whether things are constitutional or not. So following this court case of Marbury versus Madison and the fact that the Supreme Court created this power of judicial review, the Democratic Republicans started to realize, in the coming months and years, how important this actually was. And so in order to strike a blow back against the Federalists on the judicial branch, the Democratic Republicans in Congress brought impeachment proceedings against the Associate Justice Samuel Chase. Samuel Chase was kind of a loudmouth. He'd been running his mouth about how terrible the Democratic Republicans were. So this is retaliation against the Federalists on the Supreme Court. Now, impeachment does not mean to be removed from office. All it means is to have charges brought against you. And this is true for members of the executive branch, aka the president, and also the judiciary branch as well. This is one of those checks and balances that Congress has on those two branches. But the Constitution says that members of the executive and judicial branch will be impeached for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, this is ambiguous at best. Who knows what high crimes and misdemeanors are? But is a high crime and misdemeanor just talking trash, essentially, against the Democratic Republicans? So at the last minute, the Senate decided not to convict Samuel Chase of a high crime and misdemeanor and did not, therefore, remove him from office, which allowed the judicial branch to retain their independence. They are supposed to be able to make decisions separate from what Congress and separate from what the president wanted, and this is exactly what continued. Also under Jefferson, remember, Jefferson is all about having less government involvement. The best government is the one which governs the least. And so from this perspective, he was very distrustful of large armies. He thought that large armies were what would lead to a dictatorship, and very rightly so, because it had been happening all over the place. So under Jefferson's first term as president, he reduced the size of the army to 2,500 people because he distrusted them. The problem is, though, that there is a group of pirates that are from the Barbary coast of northern Africa, and they had been harassing American merchant ships in the Mediterranean Sea for years and years and years. The Federalists had basically paid them off, buying protection, similar to what we see with the mafia today, paying them off to leave American merchant ships alone. The problem is that under Jefferson's term in office, he refused to pay these Barbary pirates their protection money. And so the Barbary pirates increased their attacks on American merchant ships. So around 1801, we start to see an undeclared war with the Pasha of Tripoli. He was the commander of these Barbary pirates in the northern part of Africa. But the Americans are not exactly in a place militarily where they can fight even a war against some stupid pirates in the Mediterranean. So the end result of this Tripolitan War comes with $60,000 being paid to end this undeclared war. So in the end, these pirates ended up getting their money anyway, and it also proved that by reducing the size of the army, that Jefferson was actually hurting the Americans a little bit. But we also see a large growth in the Marine Corps also during this Tripolitan War. Now, one area where Jefferson really did excel was with the Louisiana Purchase, I guess, depending on your position with this. France is now under the control of Napoleon. He's back in charge and had reacquired the Mississippi River and New Orleans in 1800. Well, here's the problem. The U.S. had the right to use the Mississippi River under Pinckney's treaty, but that had been with Spain. Now, with France back in charge of the Mississippi River, the U.S. no longer has that right to use the Mississippi River, and they don't have the right to deposit, meaning to warehouse their products as they're being shipped down the Mississippi River and out through New Orleans. The Mississippi River was the prime way that American farmers in the West got their products to market. They would float it down the Mississippi River and out through New Orleans because at this time there are no canals to move products back east. So it is absolutely essential for American farmers in the West to have access to the Mississippi River. So Thomas Jefferson sent a diplomat, James Monroe, future president, to meet up with the American diplomat living in France, Robert Livingston, to meet with Napoleon to discuss this. They were told they had $10 million and they should try to buy the port city of New Orleans and any land they could get to the east of that. Well, Napoleon, who is facing a slave insurrection in Santo Domingo, really needs the money. So he offers to sell all of Louisiana, a whole 828,000 square miles, for $15 million, including, obviously, including New Orleans. He was facing a heavy death rate among his French soldiers with yellow fever down in the slave insurrection, and inevitably war with Great Britain is always looming on the horizon, so he was worried that should war come with Great Britain, he feared that they would capture Louisiana, and he absolutely did not want his enemy, Great Britain, to have access to this. But the question for Thomas Jefferson, who, if you remember, is a strict constructionist of the U.S. Constitution, is this constitutional? Where in the U.S. Constitution does it say you have the right to buy 828,000 square miles? You know, he'd thrown a fit over the Bank of the United States. Why should he be allowed to buy the Louisiana Purchase? Obviously, it's not in the Constitution anywhere. So, pushing aside his philosophical ideas and his ideals of strict construction, Thomas Jefferson, regardless, signs this treaty with France and acquires the Louisiana Territory on April 30th, 1803, doubling the size of the United States. And here you see a map highlighting where this Louisiana Territory is, right smack dab in the middle of what is today modern-day United States.